Imagine this. You come home after a long day. You kick off your shoes, wash your hands, make yourself something to eat, brush your teeth, and finally crawl into bed. Everything feels clean. Your kitchen looks spotless. The bathroom smells fresh. Your hands smell like soap. You go to sleep believing you did everything right. But what if I told you that several of the dirtiest things you touched today never actually looked dirty? Your shoes may have carried the outside world straight across your living room. Your phone may have traveled from a public restroom to your dinner table. Your toothbrush may have been sitting quietly beside a flushing toilet. And those hands you felt so good about washing may have been clean for only a few seconds before they touched your phone again. That's the strange part. Most contamination doesn't announce itself. It doesn't leave muddy footprints. It doesn't smell bad. It doesn't make your house look messy. It simply moves from one surface to another, from one room to the next, from your hands to the things you touch every single day. Most of us grow up believing that if something looks clean, it probably is. But looking clean and being hygienic are not exactly the same thing. A countertop can sparkle and still spread contamination. A phone can look brand new and quietly connect your bathroom, your kitchen, your car, and your face all in the same afternoon. Now, this is important. The goal of this video is not to make you afraid of bacteria. Your home doesn't need to be sterile. Life was never meant to be lived inside a laboratory. The goal is much simpler than that. It's to notice the invisible pathways that allow dirt, bacteria, and residue to travel from places they belong to places they don't. And this is where Japanese daily life offers such an interesting perspective. Many Japanese habits aren't about cleaning more. They're about creating small boundaries before contamination has a chance to spread. A pair of shoes left at the entrance, a toothbrush stored away from the toilet, a body washed before stepping into a hot bath. Small habits, small boundaries, repeated every single day. Most people never notice these little decisions, but over years, they quietly shape the cleanliness of an entire home. And that's the idea that connects everything you're about to see. Because the real difference isn't simply what Japanese people clean, it's where they draw the line. Over the next few minutes, we're going to look at 7 everyday habits that feel completely normal in many Western homes, but from a Japanese perspective, they may be doing exactly the opposite of what you intended. Some of these habits will probably make perfect sense. Others may surprise you, and one of them involves something you've almost certainly touched within the last 5 minutes. Let's begin. Before we get into the 7 habits themselves, there's something important to understand. When people talk about Japanese cleanliness, they often assume it's simply because Japanese people are more disciplined. Personally, I don't think that's the whole story. What I've come to admire is not extraordinary self-control. It's the way ordinary life is designed. Many Japanese hygiene habits aren't based on making the right decision every single time. They're based on making the better decision the easier one. That's a very different way of thinking. In many homes across Japan, cleanliness isn't treated as a special task you remember once in a while. It's quietly built into everyday routines. Small routines, repeated so often that eventually they stop feeling like decisions at all. Think about something as simple as the entrance to a home. In many Japanese houses, there's a small, lowered area called the genkan. It isn't just an architectural feature. It's a gentle reminder. The moment you step inside, the house itself tells you something has changed. Outside ends here. Home begins here. Your shoes stay below. Your slippers are already waiting above. You don't have to stop and debate what to do. The environment has already made the decision easier. You see the same idea throughout Japanese homes. The place where you wash your body is separate from the place where you soak and relax. Children don't simply hear that hand washing is important. They practice the same routine again and again until it becomes second nature. Personal items are often stored away from areas that are more likely to become contaminated. None of these habits are dramatic. In fact, that's exactly why they work. Good systems rarely depend on perfect discipline. They reduce the number of decisions you have to make. These quietly guide you toward the healthier choice without asking you to think about it every single time. And honestly, that's a lesson that goes far beyond hygiene. Whether you're trying to eat healthier, save money, exercise more, or simply keep your home cleaner, the habits that last are usually the ones your environment supports. The easier the right choice becomes, the less willpower it requires. That's one of the quiet lessons Japanese daily life has been teaching for generations, and the first boundary may already be underneath your feet. Habit 1. Wearing your outdoor shoes inside the house. Let's start with something that happens before you've even had time to sit down. You come home. Maybe you've stopped at the grocery store, filled your car with gas, walked through a parking lot, taken the subway, visited a doctor's office, or simply walked down a busy sidewalk. None of those places seem especially unusual. They're just part of everyday life. But your shoes have been collecting a little piece of every one of them. Now imagine walking through your front door. Without thinking, you cross the living room. You walk into the kitchen to put down your groceries. Maybe you step into the bedroom to grab something. To most of us, that's completely normal. But from a Japanese perspective, something important has just happened. The outside world has quietly entered your home. Not because your shoes look dirty. In fact, they may look perfectly clean. The problem isn't what you can see. It's what has been carried from one environment into another. Researchers have found that the bottoms of shoes can carry a wide variety of microorganisms picked up from public spaces. More importantly, studies have shown that some of those microorganisms can be transferred onto indoor flooring after people walk inside. That doesn't mean every floor suddenly becomes dangerous, and it certainly doesn't mean someone will automatically become sick. The important point is much simpler. A transfer has taken place, and most of the time, nobody even notices it. Think about a father coming home after work. He walks across the living room wearing the same shoes he wore through a crowded parking lot. 10 minutes later, his toddler begins crawling across that same floor. She stops for a moment, touches the floor, then puts her fingers into her mouth. Will she get sick? Maybe not. Probably not. That's not the lesson. The lesson is that something from outside quietly found its way into one of the cleanest spaces in the home without anyone realizing it. This is exactly why the Japanese Genkan is so fascinating. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a small step near the entrance. But it does something incredibly clever. It makes an invisible boundary visible. The moment you step into a Genkan, your body understands something before your mind even thinks about it. Outside ends here. Home begins here. Your shoes stay below. Your slippers are already waiting above. You don't have to rely on memory. The house gently guides the habit for you. That's the beauty of a well-designed system. Good habits become easier because the environment supports them. If you'd like to borrow this idea, you don't need to remodel your home. A simple shoe rack beside the front door, a small bench, a pair of indoor slippers, or even a spot where family members automatically leave their shoes before stepping farther inside. That's enough. You've just created 3 simple zones: the outdoor zone, the transition zone, and the indoor zone. One small boundary, repeated every day. Over time, it becomes something nobody even has to think about anymore. I once heard someone describe the difference this way, and I've never forgotten it. The West built a welcome mat and asked the outside world to wipe its feet. Japan built a boundary and asked the outside world to stay outside. And that's a surprisingly powerful idea, because shoes are only the most visible way the outside world enters your home. Habit 2. Flushing the toilet with your toothbrush out in the open. Now let's move into one of the cleanest rooms in the house, or at least the room we believe is one of the cleanest, the bathroom. Most of us have a simple routine. We use the toilet, flush, walk over to the sink, wash our hands, and the moment we leave the room, we feel like the job is finished, but something may still be happening after we've turned away. Every time a toilet is flushed, the rushing water inside the bowl creates movement. That movement can send tiny droplets and microscopic particles into the surrounding air. Most of them are far too small to see. The bathroom still looks exactly the same. The mirror is clean. The sink shines. Nothing appears different. But looking the same and remaining unchanged are not always the same thing. One of the reasons this became such an interesting topic for researchers is that they found a way to make the invisible visible. Using laser imaging, scientists were able to capture what happens in the air immediately after a toilet is flushed. The surprising part wasn't simply how high some particles could rise, it was how quickly what looked like empty air became a moving pathway. Some particles may settle on nearby surfaces, a towel, the sink counter, the flush handle, the soap dispenser, even a toothbrush sitting uncovered beside the toilet. Exactly how much reaches each surface depends on many things. The design of the toilet, whether the lid is closed, how well the room is ventilated, how far away objects are, and how often the bathroom is cleaned. That's why it's helpful to think in terms of reducing risk, not eliminating it completely. I once heard someone say something that has stayed with me. A toilet lid is a layer of protection, not a force field. I think that's exactly the right way to look at it. Closing the lid may help, but it works best as one part of a larger system. Imagine a mother who carefully cleans her bathroom every evening. The mirror shines. The floor smells fresh. The sink is spotless. She has taken the time to wipe every surface she can see, but her child's toothbrush is still sitting uncovered just a few feet from the toilet. She cleaned everything that looked dirty. She simply never thought about the direction contamination might travel. And honestly, most of us haven't. That's the lesson here. A room can look beautifully clean and still contain a poorly designed transfer path. So instead of relying on one perfect solution, think in layers. Close the lid before flushing whenever possible. Keep toothbrushes farther away from the toilet. Store them inside a clean, ventilated cabinet or covered holder if you can. Wipe down the surfaces your hands touch, most often the flush handle, the sink faucet, cabinet handles, and light switches. Then wash your hands before leaving the room. None of these habits takes very long, but together, they quietly reduce the number of opportunities contamination has to move from one place to another, because closing the lid helps, but what you do next may matter even more. Habit 3. Washing and soaking in the same bathwater. The next habit isn't just about hygiene. In many ways, it's about something even deeper. It's about protecting the purpose of a space. In many Western homes, taking a bath usually follows a familiar pattern. You fill the tub, you climb in. You wash your hair, you scrub your skin, the soap, the sweat, the body oils, and everything you've washed away all stay in the same water while you continue to soak. For most of us, that's simply what a bath has always been. A place to get clean. In Japan, the experience is very different. Before anyone enters the ofuro, they wash first. Completely. Standing or sitting beside the tub, they shower, use soap, rinse everything away, and only then step into the hot water. The water isn't there to clean the body. The body has already been cleaned. The bath is there for something else: warmth, quiet, recovery, and perhaps most importantly, a chance to leave the outside world behind. That's one of the most beautiful ideas in Japanese bathing culture. The bath isn't simply another place to finish your hygiene routine, it's a transition from work to rest, from public life to private life, from constant noise to quiet, from carrying the weight of the day to finally letting it go. Imagine a man returning home after another crowded evening train ride in Tokyo. The city has been loud all day. His phone has been buzzing since morning. His shoulders are tense. He doesn't step straight into the bath. Instead, he sits on a small stool beside it. He washes carefully, rinses away every trace of soap. His phone stays outside the room. Only then does he lower himself into the warm water. Nothing is playing. Nobody is asking for his attention. For a few quiet minutes, the world simply stops. The bath didn't erase the day. It gave the day somewhere to end. That idea has stayed with me for a long time. Because not every hygiene habit is really about killing germs. Sometimes it's about protecting the purpose of a space. A dining table is meant for eating. A bedroom is meant for sleeping. And in Japanese thinking, a bath is meant for restoration. If you'd like to try this at home, you don't need a traditional Japanese bathroom. The principle matters more than the architecture. Take a quick shower first. Rinse away the soap completely. Then fill the tub with clean, warm water. Leave your phone outside. Spend 10 or 15 quiet minutes doing absolutely nothing. No scrolling, no emails, no videos. Just warm water and stillness. You may discover that what restores you isn't only the bath itself. It's finally giving yourself permission to stop, because the next habit reveals something uncomfortable. Feeling clean and being hygienic are not always the same thing. Habit 4. Washing your hands too quickly. Now we come to the habit that may be the hardest to accept, not because it's unpleasant, but because almost all of us believe we're already doing it correctly: hand washing. Most people don't skip it. In fact, many of us are proud that we wash our hands regularly. The question isn't whether you wash them. The question is whether you finish the job. There's something psychologists sometimes call the feeling of completion. The moment we rinse off the soap and dry our hands, our brain quietly checks the task off the list. We feel clean. We move on. But feeling finished and actually finishing the job aren't always the same thing. Running water alone isn't enough. Soap matters. The friction created while rubbing your hands together matters. The amount of your hands you actually cover matters. And yes, time matters too. Public health experts commonly recommend about 20 seconds of active scrubbing with soap. But here's something many people don't realize. Time is only half the story. Coverage matters just as much. Studies have shown that the same parts of the hands are missed again and again. The thumbs, the fingertips, around the nails, the backs of the fingers, and the spaces between them. Those are often the places that receive the least attention, even when someone believes they've washed thoroughly. This reminds me of something I once saw in a Japanese elementary school. The children weren't listening to a long lecture about bacteria. No one was trying to frighten them. Instead, the teacher stood beside a row of sinks. The children simply repeated the same hand movements together: palms, backs of the hands, between the fingers, around the thumbs, across the fingertips, around the nails, again and again, until it became as natural as tying their shoes. That's the part I find most interesting. The habit wasn't waiting until adulthood. It wasn't waiting until someone became sick. It was practiced long before anyone needed to remember it. That's how good habits are built. Not through fear, through repetition, I'd like to give you a small challenge. The next time you wash your hands, don't just count to 20. Instead, ask yourself one question. Which part of my hands received almost none of those 20 seconds? You may be surprised by the answer. And if you notice the same area every time, don't worry, most people do. For the next week, focus on just 4 places: your thumbs, your fingertips, between your fingers, and around your nails. You don't need to scrub harder. You simply need to notice what you've been overlooking. Because sometimes the biggest difference isn't washing longer. It's finally washing the parts you've been missing all along. And the next habit reminds us that what feels polite isn't always what feels hygienic. Habit 5. Blowing your nose loudly in public. The next habit is a little different from the others, because this time we're not talking only about hygiene. We're also talking about manners. And those two things don't always tell exactly the same story. If you've ever traveled between different countries, you've probably noticed this yourself. Something considered perfectly normal in one culture can feel surprisingly uncomfortable in another. Blowing your nose is a good example. In many Western countries, repeatedly sniffing can be seen as distracting or even rude. Blowing your nose into a tissue often feels like the considerate thing to do. You've dealt with the problem. You've moved on. In Japan, however, the social expectation is often very different. Blowing your nose loudly at the dinner table, during a meeting, or on a crowded train can make people around you uncomfortable. Many people prefer to step away, handle it privately, and then return. Neither culture necessarily arrived at its customs because of a scientific study. Both simply developed different ideas about what respectful public behavior looks like. That's an important distinction. Culture usually comes first. Science sometimes follows later, adding a little more context, not always a final answer. Researchers have found that forcefully blowing your nose can create surprisingly high pressure inside the nasal passages. That doesn't mean blowing your nose is dangerous, and it certainly doesn't mean you should never do it. The more useful lesson is much simpler. If you need to blow your nose, try not to do it forcefully. Step away from food or from people nearby if you can. Use a tissue. Throw it away immediately. Then wash or sanitize your hands. Small actions. Simple habits. Quietly respectful. I think that's one of the reasons this Japanese custom has endured for so long. It isn't really about pretending colds don't exist. It's about recognizing that even ordinary moments affect the people sharing the space around us. That's something every culture values, just in different ways. So perhaps the lesson isn't that one culture is right and the other is wrong. It's that science and manners sometimes point in the same direction without ever becoming exactly the same thing. And the next habit shows how something that feels incredibly clean can actually spread contamination farther than most people realize. Habit 6. Washing raw chicken before cooking. The next habit is one that surprises a lot of people. Not because it's uncommon, but because it usually comes from a good place. For many families, washing raw chicken is simply something you've always done. Maybe your mother did it, maybe your grandmother did it, maybe someone once told you that rinsing the chicken made it cleaner before cooking. If that's how you learned, it probably never felt careless. It felt responsible. It felt like taking good care of the people who were about to eat your food. And that's exactly why this habit can be so difficult to change. Sometimes the hardest hygiene habit to let go of is the one that was taught as an act of love. The problem isn't the intention, it's what happens next. When water hits raw chicken, it doesn't simply wash something away. Tiny droplets bounce in every direction. Some land inside the sink, some reach the faucet, some settle on the countertop. Others may reach nearby utensils. cutting boards, clothing, or even food waiting to be prepared. The chicken is still raw. But now, the area around it may have become part of the same transfer chain. Modern food safety guidance has warned about this for years. The concern isn't the chicken itself. It's everything the water touches before the chicken ever reaches the pan. Cooking the chicken to a safe internal temperature is what destroys harmful pathogens. Washing it doesn't replace that step. In fact, it may simply move contamination farther around the kitchen. One way to picture it is like this: raw chicken, water splash, faucet handle, your hand, the salad bowl waiting beside the sink. Nothing dramatic happened. No one noticed anything unusual. But one invisible pathway quietly connected them all. Interestingly, this is one place where modern food safety guidance and the Japanese preference for controlled food preparation often arrive at the same conclusion, not because one culture is smarter than another, but because both are trying to prevent unnecessary transfer before cooking even begins. If you decide to try this yourself, the routine is actually very simple. Skip the rinse. Move the chicken directly to the cutting board or pan. If you need to remove moisture, gently pat it dry with a paper towel and throw the towel away immediately. Wash your hands. Clean the nearby surfaces. Then cook the chicken to the recommended safe internal temperature. That's the step that makes it safe, not the water. Sometimes what feels clean is simply what feels familiar. And the next habit reminds us that one ordinary object can quietly carry those invisible pathways everywhere we go. Habit 7. The one thing that crosses every boundary: your phone. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. Shoes carry the outside world into the house. A toothbrush can sit too close to a flushing toilet. Hands move from one surface to another. Raw chicken can spread contamination around the kitchen. At first, these all seem like separate habits, but they're really connected by one ordinary object: your phone. Not because it's necessarily the dirtiest thing you own, but because it travels farther than almost anything else in your daily life. Think about where your phone goes in a single day. It wakes up beside your pillow. It follows you into the bathroom. It rides with you on the train or in your car. It sits on your office desk. It comes to lunch. Maybe it visits the gym. It ends up on the kitchen counter while dinner is cooking. Then it returns to the couch and finally rests beside your bed again. Very few objects cross that many boundaries, and almost none are touched as often. That's why I like to think of a phone as a bridge object. A bridge object quietly connects places that were never meant to be connected. It carries a little bit of the public world into your private world. It reconnects freshly washed hands with everything they touched earlier, and it often does it without us noticing. Imagine a woman arriving home after work. Before she starts making dinner, she carefully washes her hands. She uses soap. She scrubs for 20 seconds. She dries them thoroughly. Everything we've talked about so far, she's done it right. Then she sits down at the kitchen table. A message appears on her phone. Without thinking, she picks it up. Her hands stayed clean for less than 5 seconds. Not because she washed them badly, because the system around her never changed. Her hands were clean. Her routine was not. That's a lesson I think many of us can relate to. We often focus on cleaning ourselves, but we forget about the objects that quietly travel with us all day long. The most important contaminated surface isn't always the dirtiest one. It's the one that never stays in one place, the one that keeps crossing boundaries. Fortunately, fixing this doesn't require anything complicated, just 3 simple habits. Try not to place your phone on food preparation surfaces. Avoid using it in the bathroom whenever you can. And clean it regularly, following the manufacturer's recommendations, especially after commuting, traveling, or visiting the gym. You can go a step further if you'd like. Use speakerphone or headphones when practical. Try not to leave your phone on your pillow at night. And if you've just washed your hands before a meal, see how long you can go before picking it up again. You might be surprised, because by now, you may have realized something. These were never really 7 separate habits. They've been the same habit all along, learning where to draw the boundary. The 7 habits were never really 7. Now that we've gone through all 7 habits, I'd like to ask you something. Did you notice what they all had in common? At first, they seemed completely unrelated. Shoes, a toothbrush, a bathtub, hands, blowing your nose, raw chicken, a phone, 7 different objects, 7 different situations, 7 different conversations. But if you look a little closer, you'll see they were all telling exactly the same story. None of these habits were really about dirt. They were about movement, something quietly traveling from one place to another, usually without anyone noticing. That's the idea I hope stays with you long after this video ends. Because once you begin seeing those invisible pathways, it's surprisingly hard to stop noticing them. Think back to the examples we've covered. A shoe walks across the living room. A child crawls across the floor. Tiny fingers reach a curious mouth. A toilet is flushed. An uncovered toothbrush waits on the counter. Raw chicken is rinsed. Water reaches the faucet. A hand touches the faucet. The same hand picks up a bowl of salad. A phone rides the train, then rests on the kitchen counter, then sits beside your pillow. Different objects, the same journey. If we could draw every one of those moments on a single piece of paper, they would all look remarkably similar. A source. A hand or an object. A clean surface. Then food or your face. That's the invisible transfer chain. And once you recognize it, the entire idea of hygiene begins to change. Instead of asking, "What should I clean today?" a better question becomes, "What crossed the boundary?" Because that's often where the real story begins. When you look at Japanese daily life through that lens, something interesting happens. You realize it isn't simply about cleaning more often. It's about designing everyday life so contamination has fewer opportunities to travel in the first place. A pair of shoes stays at the entrance. A toothbrush is stored away. The body is washed before entering the bath. Food preparation follows a careful sequence. A phone is treated as something that moves between worlds. None of these habits are dramatic by themselves, but together, they quietly interrupt the same invisible chain. And that may be the biggest lesson in this entire video. Cleanliness removes what you can see. Hygiene interrupts the transfer you cannot see. That's a very different way of thinking. And the good news is, you don't have to change all 7 habits tonight. You only have to interrupt one invisible transfer chain. Sometimes, one small boundary is enough to change everything. A simple 7-day challenge. Before you leave, I'd like to ask you for one small favor. Not for me. For yourself. Please don't try to change all 7 habits at once. That's how good intentions usually disappear after a few days. Instead, choose just one. Not 7. 1. Pick the invisible transfer chain that stood out to you the most. Maybe it's leaving your outdoor shoes at the door. Maybe it's moving your toothbrush farther away from the toilet. Maybe it's washing before soaking in the bath. Maybe it's giving your hands a more careful 20 seconds. Maybe it's changing the way you handle raw chicken. Or perhaps it's simply keeping your phone away from the dinner table. Whatever you choose, stay with that one habit for the next 7 days. But here's the part I hope you'll remember. Don't just rely on willpower. Change your environment. If your goal is to leave your shoes at the entrance, put a shoe rack or a pair of slippers where you'll see them first. If you want to protect your toothbrush, move it today instead of telling yourself you'll remember tomorrow. If your phone keeps ending up beside your plate, Create a place for it somewhere else before dinner begins. Good systems almost always beat good intentions. When the right choice becomes the easy choice, you stop having to make the same decision over and over again. That's how lasting habits are built, not through perfect discipline, but through thoughtful design. So here's my invitation. For the next 7 days, interrupt just one invisible transfer chain, then come back to this video and tell us what happened. I have one question for you. Which boundary did you protect first? Home, body, food, or pwn? Leave just one word in the comments. I genuinely love to see which boundary this community chooses first. And remember, a cleaner life doesn't always require more effort. Sometimes it begins with one small boundary, placed in the right place, repeated often enough, until you no longer have to think about it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next video.